Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take complex information and, well, really distill it down into the insights you need. Today, we're tackling something incredibly serious, a really vital topic, Europe's ability to deter Russia without full U.S. backing. And crucially, the potential fallout, maybe even literally, of a hypothetical nuclear exchange. Now, this isn't just speculation. We're drawing on a solid stack of sources. We've got analyses of defense capabilities, game theory models, climate impact studies, and importantly, direct statements from Russian figures like Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin.
Right. And our mission here for you is really to pull out the most critical pieces to understand these what-if scenarios that, frankly, shape global security. We want to give you a clear, impartial view of the facts, no matter how tough they might be to hear. It's about being truly well-informed on this.
So let's set the scene. What does Europe's defense actually look like right now? And what are the real stakes when you factor in Russia's words and, well, their muscle? Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the core idea from our sources. Without the U.S., which provides something like 70, maybe 80% of NATO's total capacity, Europe's deterrence against Russia is, well, it's called considerably weakened. That sounds pretty blunt.
It is blunt. And the sources really break down why. There are three key areas. First, on the nuclear picture, Europe has fewer than 600 active warheads. That's mainly France and the UK, mostly on subs. Now, compare that to Russia. They have around 4,300 active warheads, and a big chunk of those, maybe 1,000 to 2,000, are tactical weapons. So you're looking at a 10, maybe 15 times quantitative advantage for Russia. It's huge. And here's the thing. Without U.S. tactical nukes, like the B-61 stationed in Europe, there are about 100 of them. The whole idea of extended deterrence kind of evaporates for Europe. Extended deterrence is basically the U.S. nuclear guarantee for allies. Experts in our sources, they see no credible way for Europe alone to deter a Russian first strike in that scenario. MAD, mutual assured destruction, still applies to, all-out exchanges. But for tactical stuff, say against the Baltics, Russia has maybe a 70-80% advantage. Europe just doesn't have that same escalation ladder.
Okay, so a massive nuclear imbalance. What's the second area?
Interception capabilities. Air defense. Europe has good systems, GMT, IRIS-T, Patriot, Sky Saber. They work. But the problem is production. It's really limited. Like, Germany's planning for only 8 IRIS-T systems, maybe 800 to 1,000 interceptors in 2025. That's not a lot. Russia, on the other hand, has advanced systems like the S-400, S-500, ranges up to 400 kilometers. And they're churning out maybe 100 to 200 missiles monthly. Europe struggles to add maybe 50 interceptors a month across the board.
Wow, that's a stark difference in production scale.
It is. And then you add hypersonics, Russia's Kinzhal, Zircon. They're very hard for current European systems to intercept. Success rate, less than 50%. More than half could get through. So statistically, the sources suggest Russia has a 60-75% chance of missile breakthroughs in a large attack. Europe's intercept rate against something like that, probably under 30%.
Under 30%. Okay, and the third area, conventional forces.
Exactly. Conventional superiority and scenario chances. RAND simulations, for example, suggest Russia could potentially overrun the Baltics in just 3 to 5 days if the U.S. isn't involved, with like an 80-90% success chance. Now, troop numbers look okay on paper. Europe has about 1.9 million active personnel versus Russia's 1.3 million. But look at heavy armor, tanks. Russia has maybe 20,000 versus Europe's 5,000. Big gap. Same with artillery. So the sources estimate Europe's chances in a local conflict, say Poland or the Baltics, are actually less than 20%. Logistics are a problem, and lack of unity is often cited too.
Right. So you put it all together, the nuclear gap, the interception issues, the conventional weaknesses, this sobering outlook for European self-reliance. You said deterrence effectiveness estimated at 20-30% for Europe versus 70% plus for Russia. And NATO itself apparently sees a 70% chance of a Russian attack in the next 3-10 years. What does that really mean for Europe's ability to stand on its own strategically? This leads us right into another crucial piece, perception, messaging. How does Russia see this? What are their leaders actually saying? Because this is where it gets really interesting.
It really does. Their public statements since 2022, they're not subtle. They offer a clear window into their thinking, and, well, they function as warnings. Let's take Sergei Lavrov. July 2022. He says, "We help the Ukrainian people liberate themselves from the absolutely anti-people and anti-history regime." It's basically confirming regime change as a goal. And it warns that if Russia sees Western support as a threat, they'll use aggressive means. Connect that to Europe's 500-odd warheads versus Russia's 4,300. It's potent.
A direct threat linked to the power imbalance.
Precisely. Then, May 2022, Lavrov. The West has declared war on us, on the whole Russian world. He calls sanctions total war. This reinforces their escalate to de-escalate idea, using tactical nukes, potentially, to force an opponent to back down. And Europe's weaker interception makes it vulnerable to exactly that. July 2025, he claims Russia is fighting alone against the entire West, which, ignores support from North Korea, Iran, China, but it's a narrative to justify nuclear threats, playing on that asymmetry again.
And what about the denial of the invasion itself?
All right, March 2022. We did not attack Ukraine, calling it a special military operation. The warning there is that they could use similar narratives for actions against NATO countries, maybe the Baltics, where European defense, as we said, has low intercept rates. In July 2025, Lavrov repeats the demand. No involvement of Ukraine in NATO, no NATO expansion at all, if ignored. The implicit threat is nuclear escalation, highlighting Europe's vulnerability without that U.S. nuclear backing.
Okay, that's Lavrov. What about Putin's statements?
Putin's are just as stark, maybe more so. February 2022, right at the start. A direct attack on our country will lead to defeat and horrible consequences for any potential aggressor. Own word. That clearly implies a nuclear response to threats against Russian territory. It underlines their numerical advantage and maybe their higher perceived survival chances in a nuclear autumn. We'll get to that. Yep. September 2022. If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without doubt use all available means. This is not a bluff. That's tying nuclear use to annexed territories, banking on their better intercept systems for defense.
He seems very confident in their capabilities.
Extremely. December 2022. Any country that dared to attack Russia with nuclear weapons would be wiped from the face of the earth. Pure emphasis on counterstrike capability, leveraging that 7 to 10 times warhead advantage and better bunker capacity. February 2024, reacting to Macron, possibly suggesting NATO troops in Ukraine. We also have weapons that can strike targets on their territory. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Again, linking escalation to Europe's weaker deterrence.
And the readiness claims.
Yes, March 2024. From a military technical point of view, we are, of course, ready for nuclear war if U.S. troops get involved directly, highlighting their hypersonic and intercept advantages, and maybe the most chilling, November 2024. Any attack by a non-nuclear power supported by a nuclear power would be considered a joint attack. That lowers the threshold. It means supporting Ukraine potentially could be seen by Russia as a nuclear attack itself.
Wow. What's fascinating here is how these statements, when you lay them as the numbers we discussed earlier, they paint this really stark picture of how Russia perceives the balance of power. It's like they're spelling out their justifications for potential escalation, really emphasizing Europe's vulnerability.
Exactly. They're drawing their red lines very, very clearly and pointing to their capabilities. It's explicit.
Okay, that's a powerful look at the rhetoric. Now, let's shift gears slightly and tackle a really tough hypothetical our sources explore. It's a test of NATO, really. What if Russia did launch a nuclear attack, but only on European NATO members? The U.S. itself isn't directly hit. Would America really trade nuclear blows for Europe?
Yeah, this is where game theory comes in and it gets complex. The core NATO dilemma is Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. Simple, right? But in a nuclear scenario like this, a U.S. nuclear response is seen as, well, highly unlikely if the top priority is avoiding immediate mutual assured destruction, annihilating each other. So things like sanctions, conventional strikes, they're seen as much more probable than a nuclear retaliation from the U.S.
So the guarantee isn't quite guaranteed in that specific situation.
That's the crux of the problem for extended deterrence. The U.S. doctrine is about protecting allies, sure, but also controlling escalation so the U.S. homeland isn't targeted. Experts in our sources warn that Russia could use tactical nukes in Europe precisely because they might calculate the U.S. would hesitate, would balk at risking MAD, even if it meant, well, sacrificing European allies.
How do the models analyze that?
They use game theory concepts. Think of it like the chicken game. 2 cars heading towards each other, who swerves first. Mixed with hawk-dove strategies, aggressive versus cooperative. The stable outcome, the Nash equilibrium, suggests Russia would only attack if they thought the chance of a U.S. nuclear response was incredibly low, like less than 5%. Deterrence works if the commitment is credible, believable. If it looks shaky, it fails.
That reminds me of some Cold War thinkers.
Absolutely. Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling talked about the threat that leaves something to chance, how uncertainty itself can deter. And his famous line, "The power to hurt is bargaining power. To exploit it is diplomacy, vicious diplomacy, but diplomacy." And Robert McNamara. Mutual assured destruction is the foundation of stable deterrence. It's not mad, it's logical. But does that logic hold if only allies are hit? That's the question. In Eisenhower's wisdom, the only way to win the next world war is to prevent it.
Which brings us to this really shocking conclusion in the source material.
Yeah.
In this specific scenario, NATO could be seen as useless for Europeans. Now, for listeners who see NATO as this ironclad shield, what does useless truly mean here? Is that too strong a word?
It's a provocative word, definitely. Useless in this context means it wouldn't guarantee preventing the attack, nor would it guarantee protection from the destruction after the attack. It's because that U.S. commitment in this very specific non-U.S. targeted nuclear scenario is seen as fragile. If the U.S. prioritizes avoiding MAD above all else, extended deterrence breaks, Europe could be sacrificed. That's why critics might call NATO a paper tiger without that absolute, unquestionable nuclear guarantee, especially if U.S. isolationism grows. The implication from the sources is pretty clear. Europe needs its own independent deterrent, urgently.
That's a heavy conclusion. Okay, let's say this limited exchange does happen. What about the wider world, the planet, specifically the U.S., even if it's not targeted directly?
All right, this is where we get into nuclear winter versus nuclear autumn. It's a critical distinction the sources make. A full nuclear winter, that needs a lot of soot, 5 to 16 teragrams, maybe more blasted into the stratosphere, usually from cities burning. That could cause global cooling of 10, even 20 degrees Celsius for years. The result, catastrophic crop failures worldwide, 50 to 90% losses, global famine. Just devastating.
But that's the extreme scenario.
That's the extreme. A nuclear autumn is seen as more likely in a limited exchange, maybe a few hundred warheads, maybe focus more on military targets, not necessarily all-out city destruction. The chance of triggering a full winter in that case is lower, maybe 20 to 50%. Studies looking at, say, a hypothetical India-Pakistan conflict with 150 warheads, they predict a milder autumn. Cooling of maybe 1 to 5 degrees Celsius globally, lasting months. Still bad, but not apocalyptic winter. But here's the kicker. If escalation does hit major cities, Moscow, Paris, Berlin, then soot levels could spike, and you could potentially tip into a full nuclear winter, even from a supposedly limited start.
So even a limited conflict in Europe isn't contained. It has global ripple effects, hitting the U.S. hard, even without a single bomb landing there.
Absolutely. The U.S. would feel it directly. Climate-wise, that soot cools the whole northern hemisphere. U.S. crops, corn, wheat could see reductions of 50 to 90%. Famine. Some estimates suggest 100 to 200 million U.S. deaths just from starvation, plus a huge economic hit, 20–50% GDP loss, and globally. The chain reactions could mean more people die outside the war zone, U.S., China, India, than inside Europe or Russia. We could be talking 99% mortality in some regions from secondary effects. Migrations, pandemics, resource wars. During the Ukraine war analysis period, 2022-2025, the thinking was that even Russian tactical strikes in Europe carry these global climate risks that the U.S. might see as existential threats to itself.
Okay, so if the U.S. faces potential famine and massive disruption indirectly, does that change the game theory? Does it lower their threshold for intervention after all, even if not with nukes immediately?
It could. That's the debate. A looming nuclear autumn might compel the U.S. to intervene diplomatically, economically, maybe conventional aid to stop things spiraling, because those global effects do threaten U.S. security. But direct nuclear intervention to avoid MAD, still seen as unlikely. So it doesn't completely invalidate the original theory of U.S. non-intervention in a Europe-only nuclear fight. Why? Well, intervention depends on perception, on timing. The autumn might only become obvious after the exchange happens, too late. U.S. doctrine still prioritizes avoiding escalation. And an autumn is an indirect effect, maybe not an automatic Article 5 trigger. Plus, you always have the possibility of U.S. isolationism causing hesitation, even with global risks.
So it complicates the picture, but doesn't necessarily guarantee intervention.
Exactly. Though if the risk of a full winter looks high, say that 20–50% chance we mentioned, then the U.S. would probably act preventatively. More NATO support, stronger deterrence signals, trying to stop the exchange from ever happening. So it modifies the theory, maybe raises the stakes for prevention, but doesn't entirely break the core idea of no automatic U.S. nuclear retaliation just for Europe.
Okay, this is grim, but let's push the thought experiment further, based on the sources. If a nuclear autumn does happen, what does survival actually look like for Europe versus Russia?
Right, so we're assuming a mild nuclear autumn scenario here. Not full winter. Soot. 5–16 teragrams. Effects. 1 to 5 degrees ski cooling globally, 10–30% less rain, 20–50% less harvest yield, worse in the north. Regional crises, not total global famine. The exchange is limited, not every city flattened.
Yeah.
So short-term survival hours to months, direct effects. Europe. Population around 450 million. Immediate deaths, maybe 20 to 50 million, 5–10%. Initial survivors, 50–70%. But that drops fast, maybe to 30–50% within months. Fallout kills another 10–20 million. Then chaos. No power, water, medicine. Europe's big weaknesses: very few bunkers, less than 5% capacity EU-wide, high population density, and maybe 50–70% of the continent contaminated. Russia, population about 144 million. Immediate deaths, higher proportionally, maybe 10–30 million, 7–20%. Initial survivors, 60–80%, dropping to 40–60% in months. Russia has advantages. Huge landmass, so effects are more spread out. Better bunkers, maybe 20–30% capacity in cities like Moscow. Better intercept systems mean fewer hits get through initially. Fallout effects maybe only 30–50% of their territory. So short term, Russia probably has a 1.2 to 1.5 times higher survival chance than Europe.
Okay, that's the immediate aftermath. What about long-term, years, decades later, living in that nuclear autumn?
Long-term cumulative effects, Europe, maybe another 50 to 150 million deaths. That brings the total losses to 20–40% of the pre-war population, driven by crop failures, 50–70% less food malnutrition, disease, unrest. Long-term survival chances, maybe 20–40%. Big challenges, contaminated soil takes decades to recover, no global help as everyone's struggling. Russia, maybe another 20–50 million deaths long-term, total losses, 20–35% of population. Long-term survival chances estimated higher, maybe 30–50%. Why higher? Geography helps. Potential self-sufficiency in Siberia, green reserves. But their agriculture still gets hit hard, 60–80% losses. So Russia likely maintains that 1.2 to 1.5 times survival advantage long-term. But, and this is crucial, both sides fall below 50% survival. It points towards regional civilization collapse, not recovery.
So even in this milder nuclear autumn scenario, survival chances are better than a full winter, 20–50% versus maybe under 10%, but it's still utterly catastrophic. You're talking over 100 million dead, long-term societal breakdown. It really underlines why even a limited nuclear war is such a powerful deterrent, or should be. Okay, we have covered a huge amount of, frankly, unsettling ground today. Let's try to recap the absolute core insights. We've seen Europe's really significant deterrence gap without the U.S. We've heard Russia's explicit statements about readiness and potential justifications for escalation. We've looked at NATO's potentially fragile shield in that specific horrifying nuclear scenario. And we've touched on the devastating global costs, even from a limited exchange.
And it's important to reiterate, this deep dive exploring these grim possibilities isn't about fear-mongering. It really serves as a stark warning. It highlights how vital it is to understand these dynamics, the sheer weight of decisions being made.
Absolutely. This isn't abstract geopolitics. It has potentially very real implications for you, for everyone, for global security. It's this incredibly complex, frankly terrifying web of deterrence and potential disaster.
So perhaps the final thought to leave you with, based on everything we've unpacked from these sources, where do you think the focus for global security truly needs to be right now? Is it just about building more military capability? Is it about strengthening alliances? Or is it about prioritizing really robust, honest diplomacy above all else?
A critical question indeed. Thank you for joining us on this crucial deep dive.